family mode.
Hello, welcome to Prairie Conservation Action Plan's Prairie's Got the Goods Week. My name is Caitlin Morose and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Check out other events going on for Prairie's Got the Goods Week. If you are in the Swift Current area this evening, swing by Casey's Dining Room to check out a presentation by Ranchers Stewardship Alliance called Valuing Ecosystem Services Provided by Native Prairie at 7 p.m. Tomorrow, we have a talk at noon by Tara Muller-Davidson called A Perfect Partnership, Ranching and Native Prairie. Our final presentation for the week will be Biodiversity in Alberta's Grasslands by Dr. Cameron Carlisle with the University of Alberta. Check out the PCAP website for more information about these events and other upcoming webinars. I would like to take a moment to note that in-kind support for this project has been given by Ducks Unlimited Canada. This project was undertaken with the financial support of the Government of Canada and the Federal Department of Environment and Climate Change Canada. Now a bit about our presenter. Chuck Deschamps is a resource specialist with Ducks Unlimited Canada, working out of Ducks Wadena office. He holds an Honours Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Management from the University of Guelph, and over his career has worked for Delta Waterfowl and the Canadian Wildlife Service. During his 26 years with Ducks, Chuck has worked with producers delivering conservation farm programs such as forage, grazing, and wetland restoration programs. He has conserved wetlands and native uplands through purchase and conservation easements, and been responsible for managing Ducks' large marsh projects and seeded upland nesting cover projects in the Quill Lakes area. His current role with Ducks Unlimited Canada is with industry and government relations, advocating for wetland conservation. Chuck has been an active member of the PCAP Steering Committee for over 10 years. Before we begin, I would like to mention that if you have any questions during the presentation, to type it into the question section on your webinar dashboard. All of the questions and comments will be answered at the end of the presentation. And now I will turn it over to Chuck.
Thanks, Caitlin, and thanks on behalf of Ducks Unlimited and myself for this opportunity.
No problem. We can't see your screen yet. Did you get?
Yeah, you should be up now. Can you see it now?
No. We'll just try it again here.
Sure. Yeah, because it did pop up saying show screen, and I clicked yes, and
okay.
Show my screen, yes.
Oh, it was there. There it is. Perfect. We are good to go.
All right. So yeah, thanks for everyone for joining, and as Caitlin mentioned, my presentation today is on wetlands have the goods or got the goods, the environmental benefits that wetlands provide. So for the next little bit, I guess I'm going to talk about what exactly is a wetland, define some of the EGNS or the ecological goods and services that wetlands provide, and then talk a little bit about what happens to these benefits when we lose wetlands. So with that, I guess a little bit about Ducks Unlimited Canada. DU, as most of you may know, is a private nonprofit conservation agency. We've been around for almost 80 years, 79 years this year, started in 1938. And our first project in Saskatchewan was the Waterhen Marsh over by Canistino. And that big project was initiated because producers had been farming some peatlands up in that area, and there were fires, and they decided to restore a large drain marsh in order to put the fires out and sort of put some land back into the environment. So that was DU's first project in Saskatchewan. The other thing is that we pride ourselves on the fact that we are guided by science. We have our own research institute, the Institute for Wetlands and Waterfowl Research, and they guide us in all our programs, our delivery. We evaluate the programs that we put on the ground to make sure that any money that we are spending on conservation is going in the right place and doing what we think it should. So in terms of wetlands, most of you probably also know that we are found in what's known as the prairie pothole region. And that's a large area that basically stretches from Iowa up through the Dakotas and Minnesota into Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And that area has the distinction of, during the last glaciation, having a lot of deposits of ice and till, and created that pothole topography that you see in the upper right-hand corner. And so, although much of the area has a lot of scattered wetlands, they do vary in area, in density, and size. So what exactly is a wetland? Wetland, as defined by Wetlands Canada, and it's sort of the accepted definition, is any area that's saturated with water long enough to promote aquatic processes, typically has poorly drained soils, and hydrophytic or water-loving vegetation. So if you have those three things, when you see water in the environment, then you can say you have a wetland. If you're missing one of those, then chances are it's probably not a wetland. Wetlands come in many shapes and sizes in Saskatchewan. They are predominantly determined by the depth of the water and how long that water persists. And that combination of factors creates a number of different types of wetlands, and the vegetation responds to those different depths and permanency. So we have things like ephemeral wetlands. Those are the wetlands that show up early in the spring when the snow first melts. They're typically dry before seeding time or shortly thereafter, to more of the seasonal wetlands that dry up usually by July, that they get hayed typically, and then the more permanent wetlands, your semi-permanent and your permanent water bodies, where you typically see the cattails and the bulrushes. The ephemeral wetlands are extremely important in the spring to migratory birds because they tend to have a lot of invertebrates, the first invertebrates that come out of the soil and beginning a new season, provide a lot of food resources for those migrating birds, ducks. So that's typically where you see the birds early in the spring, and then they'll move on to the more permanent wetlands as the seasons progress. The other thing that happens is that wetlands are very dynamic, so the amount of water in a wetland varies from year to year. And so some years we may have wetlands that are almost completely dry, or in extreme flood situation like you see in the bottom left. And they go through that cycle regularly. It's not uncommon for them to do that. And a lot of the wetland plants that you'll see in wetlands have adapted to grow. Their seeds germinate in that dry, wet soil, and then they take off from there. So you need that drawdown or that dry spell as part of the cycle. So just to give you a better appreciation of that, this is a wetland here. It's the same wetland picture taken at various times throughout the year, or over a series of years, I should say. And you can see that it ranges from almost overflowing to completely dry, and the one in the upper right-hand corner there was actually hayed that year before it was so dry. So wetlands are very dynamic. They vary from year to year. But the one thing you'll notice is that they tend, even when they're quite full, not to spill too much. They might connect with our other wetlands nearby, but they generally don't begin flowing across the landscape to any great extent. The other unique thing about wetlands is that they're typically found with other native prairie habitats. So they're found in the parklands, in the moist mixed grasslands, as well as the grasslands ecoregions. And so that kind of makes them unique in that they're found in all three of those ecoregions and through a variety of different habitats with different species and plants and animals. So ecological goods and services. What do wetlands do for us? The term EG&S, or ecological goods and services, is a relatively new term, and it was developed primarily, I think, to begin the discussion and point out that we can put a price tag on nature, that nature has value. And typically when we think of nature and value, we think of things like fresh water, forage, wildlife, the goods that our environment produces for us. But I think we're just starting to appreciate that besides those goods, there's also services, and those services are quite wide and ranging, from water purification for wetlands to waste treatment, erosion control, carbon capture, flood and drought protection, habitat biodiversity, pollination, as well as recreation and aesthetics. So you can see there's a lot of services that those ecological services that are provided by wetlands. However, in most cases, there aren't sort of pricing mechanisms for those services. So we know what, say, a liter of water is worth, or a bale of hay, but we don't know what water purification is worth, or flood and drought protection, until we actually start to see some of the damages that result. So as I mentioned, things like providing source water, filtering nutrients and contaminants from our water, flood and drought protection, and wildlife habitat for a number of species. As well, recreational opportunities, everything from bird watching to enjoying the environment to outdoor sporting activities. So why is it important to incorporate wetland benefits into public policy and to consider EG&S when we're doing land use planning or development? One of the key reasons is that it leads to more efficient decision making. We're starting to realize that the loss of the benefits of those EGS over time can be quite substantial. And if we're planning for them, if we're taking them into consideration, then we can avoid their overuse and ensure their sustainable use. And it ensures that we'll continue to get those benefits. So really thinking about EG&S in planning isn't about preventing development, it's about protecting it and making sure that it's sustainable and that we're making better formed decisions. So given that, what are sort of some of the benefits that wetlands provide? As I said, we're starting to realize, as you can see from this slide, that wetlands are more than just water hazards. We know that they are very important to biodiversity. In Saskatchewan, they support over 45 species of waterfowl, hundreds of species of other birds, mammals, invertebrates, and plants, and up to 1/3 of the rare, threatened, or endangered species rely on wetlands to some degree in completing their life cycle. We know, for example, that fisheries are very important. Fish rely on wetlands, especially shallow parts of wetlands, for nursery habitat and for foraging habitat. And we can put a price tag on that because we know that, for example, in Canada, about 4 million people participate annually in recreational fishing, and that results in about a $4.4 billion return to the economy. We also know that waterfowling in Saskatchewan is fairly important. We know that millions of waterfowl migrate through Saskatchewan. 70% of the continental waterfowl migrate through Saskatchewan, either nesting here or migrating through to breed further north. And we know that in Saskatchewan we have some of the highest breeding densities of waterfowl in North America, over 60 breeding pairs per square mile. In terms of the economy, one of the most current studies was completed by the Ministry of Environment in 2006, and they found that outfitting in Saskatchewan resulted in $39 million gross expenditures, while non-outfitted hunting resulted in $68 million, for a total of just over $100 million annually and the creation of over 1,000 full-time jobs. Combine that with fisheries in Saskatchewan, you're looking at about $300 million annually, or roughly about 20% of the total tourism that's spent in this province every year. And those are 2006 numbers, so they would be higher now. And we know that tourism a lot relies on sort of aesthetics and water, lakes and rivers, so you know that wetlands are part of that as well. We also know from a biodiversity point that wetlands, even though they cover a very small acreage in Saskatchewan, are very diverse with a number of species. Like I mentioned, large diversity of plant species. Over 1/2 of all of North American bird species nest or feed in wetlands. And a lot of these birds provide ecological benefits that we are just starting to appreciate. So for example, tree swallows eat flies that live in alfalfa and ants that feed on barley. So having tree swallows around are beneficial to crop production. We also know that wetlands play an important role in supporting our pollinators that pollinate our various crops and forages. Many beneficial insects rely on wetlands, and they're an integral part of the food chain for other species. Dragonflies, for example, help reduce mosquito populations, but they also eat aphids that impact crops and other plants. And as I mentioned, we know that many crops, forages, and native plant species rely on pollination from wild insects, and wetlands provide habitat for those insects. In Saskatchewan, or I should say in the U.S., some of the estimates we've seen, $57 billion a year is what they peg the services provided by pollinators to agriculture. And so for that very reason, DU has recently joined with agriculture and various industry, crop grower, pesticide, and fertilizer groups through the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops to begin looking at the benefits that wetlands provide to crop production in terms of pollinators. And there's a quote you'll see there from Gregory Sekulik that basically says, yeah, these little potholes in the field that we may thought have been more of a nuisance or a hazard to farming may actually have a lot of benefit by helping pollinators, providing pollinator habitat to pollinate our crops. We also know that wetlands provide forage. Those seasonal wetlands that I mentioned that dry up on occasion, typically in summer, have a lot of white-top grass in them, or slough hay as some of the locals would call it. And those areas typically yield substantial amounts of forage for cattle. And especially in dry times when there's very little production, hay production off the upland areas, production from these wetland areas that with the slough hay can be quite significant. We're also coming to understand that wetlands play a big role in climate regulation. For a while there was a lot of debate in the academic world about whether wetlands were sinks or sources of greenhouse gases, because as anybody that's been out to a wetland knows, you typically sometimes get a whiff of some different gases that are coming up from the wetlands. And so for the longest time there was quite a considerable thought that maybe they were actually contributing to global warming. But indeed what we found is actually the exact opposite, that wetlands are indeed a net carbon sink. They do emit some greenhouse gases, but at the end of the day, when the balance sheet is tallied up, they are carbon sinks. So they store carbon. And the fact that those water areas it takes a lot of heat to change water temperature, so they have a net cooling effect on the atmosphere. They estimate that Canada's peatlands currently store about 60% of all the carbon that's currently stored in soils. So wetlands play a significant role in carbon storage. There's approximately 360 million tons is what's estimated to be currently stored in Saskatchewan's remaining wetlands, and that's about 10 times the annual total emissions from all transportation sources. So a significant amount of carbon is still stored in our wetlands, even though we have lost some. We have a lot of carbon still stored in those wetlands, and to the tune of about 89 tons per hectare per year. So that's a fairly high number. No-till farming, as some of you may know, zero-till, when it was introduced, it's been introduced for a number of years now and does a lot of great things for the environment, from conserving soil and reducing fuel use and inputs. And it's also been touted as sort of a carbon carbon capture program. But in recent years, it's actually some debate over whether or not that actually does contribute or store carbon, whereas we know for a fact that wetlands do, and substantially. However, we also know that every hectare of wetland drained also releases more carbon into the atmosphere. In Canada, Ducks Unlimited has estimated that we lose approximately 80 acres of wetlands every day. And that's like adding the CO2 emissions of over 200 cars to the road. So we know that draining wetlands or converting wetlands to other uses has an unintended consequence of releasing carbon into the atmosphere. As I mentioned earlier, wetlands also help with preventing floods and droughts. We know that wetlands basically act like giant sponges. If you think of giant sponges sort of scattered across the landscape. And so what they do is the water flows into these low depressional areas and it stays there. And it gradually is released into the surrounding soils. It recharges our groundwater supplies. In cases where those wetlands are connected through rivers or streams, the vegetation in those wetlands slows the release of water and slows the flow of water down, and that actually reduces peak flows, so it reduces the impacts of flooding downstream. During drought periods, those stores of water can last for several years, so those wetlands can help us get through droughts and provide much needed water when there's not a lot of water around. Typically, wetlands have been referred to as green infrastructure. And so using existing wetlands and restoring wetlands in both an agricultural and an urban landscape can provide a lot of relief from flood and drought. And why do we need relief from flood? Well, in the prairies, our hydrology is based primarily on spring runoff. In our prairie watersheds, about 80% of the runoff we see into our wetlands and across our landscapes come during the spring from melting snow. We have a very long winter, and the snow accumulates over that period, and then in the spring we have that big flush of water that runs off across the landscape. Now in landscapes where we have wetlands, intact wetlands, you'll see that for the most part that water drains off the landscape into those wetlands, and that's as far as it goes. As I mentioned earlier, some of those wetlands may get larger, they may join up, but typically they don't go anywhere. And so that's typically what has been defined as a non-contributing area. So it doesn't flow downstream. Whereas where you have creeks and other areas that are connected, that area does flow downstream. And so it's not uncommon, to see spring runoff where you'll see creeks and rivers start to flow and water levels rise and volumes of water increase as the spring melt progresses. So this is an example of how that works. So here you see some wetlands, and they're in a landscape. But as those wetlands get drained, what happens is that contributing area, or the drainage area that flows downstream, gets bigger. And so what ends up happening is we see an increase or a substantial amount of new water, or an increase in both the flows and volumes of waters going downstream. And that's what can cause some flooding. Wetlands also filter nutrients and contaminants from our water. Anyone that's been to a wetland and sees some of the processes that are going on there realizes that there's a lot of biological activity going on. And you'll see everything from plants growing in the water, under the water, on the edge of the water surface, emerging out of the water. And so all those plant materials and various processes are utilizing nutrients that are flowing into them from the surrounding landscape. So as I mentioned earlier, most of those wetlands aren't connected to other rivers or streams, so all those nutrients and contaminants that are flowing off the urban and agricultural landscapes flow into a wetland, and there they stay. And they get used up. They, through processes like sedimentation, heavy particles filter out, and then we have biological processes like algae in the plants using up a lot of the phosphorus and nitrogen. And then we also have soils which are binding up some of the contaminants in the water as well. Just to show you how effective that is, here's some estimates that DU has come up with, and just showing it, for the most part, a lot of those nitrogen and phosphorus and contaminants, and including pesticides that enter our water system, get used up or are bound in the soils in wetlands. Sources of these nutrients, well, as I mentioned, they come from both urban and agricultural. In the urban environment, we have sewage, the occasional release of sewage sometimes, septic tanks, stormwater runoff in particular flows into our lakes and rivers and streams and wetlands. But we also have non-point source, such as agriculture, and that's not one particular area. It's more of a watershed scale, and when we see soil erosion, that also releases some nutrients. So one of the things that we've seen change, as I mentioned earlier, is there's a lot of conservation tillage out there, and that has been adopted by a great number of farmers, for the environment and also for their bottom line. We know that it has a lot of soil and water quality benefits. One of the things that we're just learning, though, however, is that, as I mentioned, when we have our spring melt and our runoff, it is not uncommon for the surrounding agricultural fields to become saturated with water. The snow, when it melts, it goes through a long freeze and thaw process. The ground is frozen solid, almost like pavement, so there's no infiltration. That water doesn't go into the ground. It basically flows off to the nearest wetland. And what we found when we began looking at some of this water and the water quality is that it contains phosphorus and in high quantities. And unlike previous research that showed that much of the phosphorus was bound to soil particles, this phosphorus is in solution. So it's readily mobile, it's in the water, and moves with the water. So what does that mean when we have spring runoff? Well, that means the water that's running off the landscape has a lot of phosphorus in dissolved form. So this is a slide showing some of our water quality testing equipment, and as you can see, there's a wetland there in the spring, and it's filled up with water from the surrounding snow melt and will continue to fill up. But in this case, that particular wetland has a drain in it. So by mid-April, when that drain unfreezes and opens up, that water all drains away and carries with it all the available phosphorus. And this is an unintended consequence of nutrient release downstream. Producers do a very good job of trying to manage their nutrients and maintain that it ends up in the crops they're trying to grow. But this is one unintended consequence of draining wetlands, is that phosphorus in a dissolved form flows downstream. And when we've looked at that, when our IWWR research staff within Ducks Unlimited looked at this, they found that yes, indeed, not only does it flow off the landscape, but it actually, the amount flowing, or the amount of phosphorus loading, actually increases as the water yields. So the more water that gets drained off the landscape, the more phosphorus is released. And so if you look at that same graphic, you can think of in the spring what happens is there's a bunch of phosphorus that runs off the landscape during the snow melt, and that ends up in all those little wetlands, and also some of it ends up in that contributing area or in the drainage area that flows downstream. But by far and large, most of it ends up in those wetlands. However, under drainage situation, we find that almost all or a lot of that phosphorus ends up downstream, and so that's causing a lot of problems, causing a lot of nutrient loading, and that's been a big issue, and it's getting to be a much larger issue in North America, all over the world, with nutrient loading as a result of these unintended nutrients running off the land. So why is that bad? Well, what it does is it leads to eutrophication. So what we see is increased nutrients provide abundant resources for things like algae and so we get large algal blooms. Algae uses up a lot of oxygen, so in extreme cases it can lead to fish kills. Algae can also be toxic, so there's some health risks there. We've heard in the news, cases where some towns have had to stop their water intake because of algal toxins in the water. We know that it impacts fisheries, and we also know that it has aesthetic issues and definitely impacts recreation and tourism. Probably the most notable case right now is Lake Winnipeg. Lake Winnipeg is so green that you can actually see it from space. The slide there is actually a beach. You can see people in the upper right-hand corner with strollers and umbrellas. Not the best situation to be in terms of trying to enjoy a nice day out at the lake. And, definitely some health concerns. And it has cost, or is costing that lake, millions of dollars. It's impacting their tourism industry as well as their fishing industry, and they're working to try to correct that. So we know that wetlands provide all these benefits. So are wetlands under any threat? I've mentioned that, we have seen some drainage. What sorts of threats are they under? Well, we know that drainage is occurring throughout the Prairie Pothole region, throughout all of Canada. As I mentioned earlier, we lose 80 acres a day. And it happens for a number of reasons. We have a lot of developments going on, urbanization, agriculture is expanding. We see that because of the way that our water runs off the land and the way we treat our water, that we're seeing pollution and nutrient loading. Our wetlands are also being affected by climate change, and we're seeing more and more invasive species. So what happens when we lose these wetlands? Well, we know that wetlands provide all kinds of ecological goods and services. And when we lose wetlands, we lose those services. Unfortunately, when we go to replace them, most of what's available to replace a wetland are single-purpose replacement functions. So, for example, if you wanted to try to deal with the nutrient loading coming out of a drained wetland with somehow treating that water, you could do that. But you aren't doing anything for biodiversity, you aren't doing anything for carbon capture, you aren't doing anything for flood and drought. So a lot of the alternatives are single purpose, as well as they tend to be very expensive. In fact, can be far more expensive than actually just working with nature and utilizing that wetland to produce those EG&S benefits that we receive. Another unique feature about wetlands is that they are, unlike other native prairie habitats, they are protected by legislation in Saskatchewan. Unlike prairie grasslands or the aspen parklands, wetlands in Saskatchewan are protected by a number of acts. Water belongs to the province in Saskatchewan, and so the province has control over what happens to it. And that occurs through a number of different pieces of legislation, like the Water Rights Act, which guarantees landowners access to the water that's on the land that they own. Environmental Management Protection Act, which dictates how developments can occur. If you're going to alter a shoreline, what you can do to do that. The Water Security Act, which deals primarily with agricultural drainage, but also urban drainage. And Fisheries and Oceans Canada, there's federal acts that may come into play where there's fisheries involved. So why do we lose wetlands? If wetlands produce all these great ecological goods and services and provide us with all these abundant benefits, why are we losing wetlands? And there are a number of reasons, but probably some of the key ones are that, in general, governments and societies undervalue wetlands. There's no immediate monetary gain. There's nobody paying for wetlands right now, but there's lots of other potential uses of land that do pay. We do have, as I mentioned, wetland policies and legislation in this province, but in general they're currently inadequate, and there's very little compliance and enforcement. Some of the recent estimates that we've heard from the Water Security Agency is that there's currently about 100 to 150,000 quarter sections in Saskatchewan with illegal drainage on them. We also know that the wetland incentive programs that would help producers keep wetlands on the land are also inadequate. There aren't very many of them, and where they are, they can't afford to fund the amount of wetland retention or restoration that would be required. And producers also receive a lot of market signals to drain. They benefit from draining. That makes it more cost efficient to seed their land and harvest their land. It also makes the value of their land go up. They can seed more crops, so they get more return on their land. So there's lots of market signals that are encouraging wetlands, just like grasslands, to be converted to other uses. So what does wetland look like in Saskatchewan? Well, according to PCAP, we've lost about 71% of our natural areas in the Aspen Parklands and about 76% of our natural grasslands. And that's just a slide showing, a typical landscape in the parklands in the 1950s with sort of a mosaic of cultivated land, woodland, and wetlands to just 2000, which is almost 17 years ago, where most of that habitat and natural areas have converted to cropland. In Saskatchewan, we lose 28 acres of wetlands a day. That's about the size of 14 football fields. So wetland loss in Saskatchewan is ongoing, and it is significant. What's that look like? Well, from the air in some of the areas, it's quite easy to see the impacts of wetland drainage. You can see a network of agricultural drainage ditches everywhere. In the cities, we see our cities expanding, utilizing wetland areas to develop more areas for housing or industrial development. And in general, we're seeing wetland loss continue throughout Saskatchewan. Just there are some examples of the amount or the extent of wetland loss that we've seen. In general, the number that we use is about 70% of the wetlands in Saskatchewan in the settled areas has been lost, but it varies from area to area. Some areas don't have that high a loss and other areas have high. This is a study that we did over in the St. Gregory landscape by Humboldt. And this is a picture of the landscape in 1974. Every one of those sort of squares you see would be a section of land, and at that time much of the area was covered with water, lots of wetlands. As you can see, there's a photo there in the upper left-hand side that kind of shows what the topography would look like. And then here we are in 2002. Up to 90% of those wetland areas have been lost, converted to cultivated land to grow crops. And so, fairly stark contrast between the two images. Whoops, there we go. Just to go back and forth, you can see that there has been a very significant change in that landscape. One of the more recent areas that we've looked at is in conjunction with Dr. Pomeroy with the Smith Creek area near Churchbridge. And as you can see there, 1958 on the left-hand side, 2009 on the right, significant amount of drainage had gone into that area. And in fact, that area, like most others, we continue to see wetland loss. Well, what does that do, really? Part of Dr. John Pomeroy's research looked at that hydrology change over 1958 to 2009, and he looked at what we discussed earlier in terms of changes to drainage patterns, the loss of wetlands, the contributing area, and found some very significant things. He found that since 1958 to 2009, the area contributing water downstream increased by 384%. So a very large increase in the amount of land that was contributing water downstream. And that resulted in both increases in the volume of water flowing and the peak flows downstream. And he estimated that in normal to dry years, that volume of water flowing downstream increased about 200 to 300% above what was considered normal back in 1958. And that those flows increased by about 150 to 350%. Equally interesting was that even in the wet years, so even in one of the wettest years we've had, which was 2011, when a lot of the wetlands were full, there was still an increase in the flows and volumes of water, 29% increase in volumes and 32% increases in flows. So even in wet years, it had a significant impact. So how do we manage for wetlands? How do we make sure that we can incorporate those benefits, those EG&S benefits, while still maintaining development? Everyone would agree that development is good in general, and that it's good for our economy, it's good for our lifestyles. And so one of the things that is critical to employ is mitigation. And mitigation is a sequence where basically you set out your priorities in terms of first avoiding impacts, working to minimize those impacts if you have to have them when you have development, and as a last case scenario, replacing those benefits, and so, or compensating for those losses. And so the Ministry of Environment has developed guidelines. Currently they're voluntary guidelines under EMPA, and they've been utilizing those with a number of industry partners in Saskatchewan. And so really, as I mentioned earlier, it's not about anti-development, it's about protecting those EG&S benefits and in making sure that those benefits are maintained while still allowing development to go ahead. DU has been an active partner in this. We have been working on mitigation for, well, at least probably the last 10 years directly with industry, oil, mining, rail lines, highway developments in Saskatchewan. And we have experience in restoring hundreds of wetlands, not just the large marshes that we are typically known for, but also just small wetlands, half-acre, 1 acre, 2 acre, 3 acre wetlands that we see scattered across the countryside. So we have a lot of expertise and knowledge in how to do that, and we're a trusted partner with government and industry on how to do that. Here's just an example of some of that in Saskatchewan. Next time you're in Regina and driving around on the Louvain interchange there on Highway number 1, that particular development was mitigated for. That development destroyed quite a number of wetlands in the process, and so the Ministry of Highways agreed that they would follow the Ministry of Environment mitigation guidelines, and they agreed to a wetland restoration ratio of 3:1. So for every 1 acre of wetland that was destroyed, they agreed to replace it with 3 acres of wetlands in the nearby area. So a total of 38 hectares or 74 acres restored as part of that development. Similarly with the ongoing Regina bypass right now, they are also mitigating there. About 100 hectares or 247 acres of wetlands will be destroyed as part of that development, and that particular mitigation ratio is 1:1. So for every acre that's being destroyed, they will work to replace that with another wetland acre being restored somewhere else. And so typically that involves going out and restoring a drained wetland, buying that land or paying a producer for that land to restore that wetland to make up for the loss, resulting in a net, no net loss of those EG&S benefits in those wetland acres. And the wetland ratio, the ratio that they use can vary. It depends on the type of wetland being impacted, where it's located, you know, if it's in critical areas, and that sort of bumps up the ratio. But also if there's, you know, development areas where there's abundant wetlands, where they're not as critical, the ratio can be much lower. So it is tied to the amount of wetlands in the area and the benefits that we receive from them, but it also links back to what the developer has to do to compensate. I mentioned Lake Winnipeg earlier. One of the strategies, they've got a number of strategies that they're using to move forward in terms of trying to reduce those nutrients from reaching Lake Winnipeg, and one of those is keeping water on the land. By restoring wetlands, those nutrients will get trapped in those wetlands and get used up and won't reach Lake Winnipeg. So that's one of the strategies that they've taken along with several others there. And what's that look like? Well, that just means putting some ditched or just drained wetlands back to the way they were, back to their natural water levels. Ducks Unlimited, along with some of the local watershed stewardship groups, delivered a program from 2014 through 2016. Through that program, it was a 10-year program, we paid producers through that fund and with some of our own funds from Ducks Unlimited, $200 per acre per year. So fairly good return to restore those wetlands if you were in a cultivated land. It was typically combined with forage programs as well. So if you wanted to seed a piece of cultivated land back to grass, you could do that and combine it with, get funding to help you do that from Ducks Unlimited, as well as CPS, and then also restore your wetlands. So a fairly substantial program there. In the end, it resulted in about 106 wetlands being restored for a total of 360 acres. So again, very small wetlands, and as we've come to discover, it doesn't take very much to restore those wetlands. Typically, the seed bank from those wetland plants is still in the soil and can persist for a very long time, sometimes decades. So simply just adding water back to the land, those plants will regenerate, start to sprout and grow, and within a couple years you'll have a fully functioning wetland back where there once was one. So just to kind of sum things up here, I know we're getting close to the end of my presentation, so this is just a little video. Hopefully this works. Which should summarize a lot of what I've said. So yeah, just in summary then, I guess, one of the things we can control, I guess, is Mother Nature in terms of the amount of rain and snow that we get in any given year. But wetland loss and the unintended consequences that impact the EG&S benefits that we receive from wetlands, that's something that we can control. And so through wetland conservation and sound mitigation, we can ensure that those EG&S benefits that we receive from wetlands will continue on into the future. So with that, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to give this presentation, and I'll turn it back over to Caitlin if anyone has any questions. And on behalf of Ducks Unlimited, thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Chuck. That was really interesting, and I really enjoyed the video at the end. So thank you for the great presentation.